The
The
Lottery by
Lottery by
Shirley
Shirley
Jackson.
Jackson.
The
The
morning of
morning
June
of June
27th was
27th
clear
was
and
clear and
sunny,
sunny,
with the
with the
fresh
fresh
warmth of a
warmth of a
full
full
summer
summer
day.
day.
The
The
flowers
flowers
were
were
blooming
blooming profusely,
profusely,
and
and
the
the
grass
grass
was
was richly
richly
green.
green.
The
The
people of the
people of the
village began to
village
gather
began
in
to
the
gather in
square
the
between
square
the post
between the
office
post
and the
office
bank.
and the bank.
Around 10 o'clock, in some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th.
The
But in this
Lottery by
village,
Shirley
where
Jackson.
there were only about 300 people,
The
the
morning
whole
of June
lottery took only
27th
about
was
2
clear and
hours,
sunny,
so it could
with the
begin at
fresh
10 o'clock
warmth
in
of
the
a full
morning and
summer
still
day.
be through in
The
time to
flowers
allow
were
the
blooming
villagers to get home
profusely,
for
and the
noon
grass
dinner.
was richly green.
The children
The people of
assembled
the
first.
village began to
Of
gather in the
course, the
square between the
school
post office
was
and the bank.
recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on the most of them.
The
They
Lottery by
tended to
Shirley
gather
Jackson.
together quietly for a while before they broke
The
into
morning of
boisterous
June
play, and their
27th
talk
was
was
clear
still of
and
the
sunny,
classroom
with the
and the
fresh
teacher,
warmth of a full
of
summer
books
day.
and
The
reprimands.
flowers were
Bobby
blooming
Martin had already
profusely,
stuffed
and the
his
grass
pockets
was
full of
richly
stones,
green.
and the other
The
boys
people of
soon
the
followed his
village began to
example,
gather in the
selecting the
square between
smoothest
the post
and
office and
rounded
the bank.
stone. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie de la Crux, the villagers pronounced this name Delacroix,
The
eventually
Lottery
made a
by
great
Shirley
pile of
Jackson.
stones in one corner of the square
The
and guarded
morning of
it
June
against the
27th was
raids of the
clear
other
and sunny,
boys.
with the
The
fresh
girls stood
warmth of a
aside,
full summer
talking
day.
among
The
themselves, looking
flowers were
over their
blooming
shoulders at the boys,
profusely, and the
and the very
grass
small
was richly
children
green.
rolled in dust
The
or
people of the
clung to the
village
hands of
began
their
to
older
gather in the
brothers or
square between the
sisters.
post office and the
Soon the
bank.
men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors, and taxes. They stood together,
The
away from
Lottery
the
by
pile of
Shirley
stones in the
Jackson.
corner, and their jokes were quiet and they smiled
The
rather than
morning
laughed.
of June
The
27th
women
was
wearing
clear and
faded
sunny,
house dresses
with
and
the fresh
sweaters
warmth
came
of a full
shortly
summer
after their
day.
men
The
folk.
flowers were
They
blooming
greeted one another and
profusely, and the
changed bits
grass
of
was
gossip
richly
as they
green.
want to join their
The people
husbands.
of the village
Soon the
began to
women,
gather in the
standing by their
square
hands,
between the
began to
post
call to
office
their
and the bank.
children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and
The
ran.
Lottery by
Laughing
Shirley
back to the pile of
Jackson.
stones, his father spoke up sharply, and
The
Bobby
morning
came
of June
quickly and took
27th
his
was clear
place
and
between his
sunny,
father and
with the
his
fresh
oldest brother.
warmth of a full
The
summer
lottery
day.
was
The
conducted as
flowers
were
were
the square
blooming
dances, the
profusely,
teenage
and the
club, the
grass
Halloween
was
program
richly
by
green.
Mr. Summers, who had
The
time and
people of
energy
the
to devote to
village
civic
began to gather in
activities.
the square
He was
between
a
the post
round-faced,
office and the
jovial
bank.
man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. After he arrived in
The
the square
Lottery
carrying
by
the black
Shirley
wooden box,
Jackson.
there was a murmur of conversation among the
The morning of
villagers,
June
and he
27th
waved
was
and
clear
called,
and
"Little late
sunny,
today,
with the
folks."
fresh
The
warmth of a
postmaster,
full
Mr.
summer
Graves,
day.
followed him,
The
carrying
flowers
a
were
three-legged
blooming
stool, and the stool
profusely,
was
and
put
the
in the
grass
center of the
was
square, and
richly
Mr.
green.
Summers set
The
the black
people of
box
the
down on it.
village began to
The
gather in the
villagers kept
square
their
between the
distance,
post
leaving a
office
space
and the bank.
between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand?" There was a hesitation before two men, Mr. Martin and his oldest
The
son,
Lottery by
Baxter,
Shirley
came
Jackson.
forward to hold the box steady on the stool while
The
Mr.
morning of
Summers
June
stirred
27th was
up the
clear and
papers inside
sunny,
it.
with the fresh warmth of a
The
full summer day.
original
The flowers were
paraphernalia for the
blooming
lottery had been lost
profusely,
long
and the
ago, and the
grass was
black
richly
box, now
green.
resting on the stool,
The
had
people
been
of the
put into
village
use.
began to
Even
gather
before
in
the
the
old man
square
Warner,
between the
the
post
oldest man
office
in
and the
town,
bank.
was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as we
The
represented by the
Lottery
black
by
box.
Shirley
There
Jackson.
was a story that the present box had been made with
The
some
morning
pieces
of
of the
June
box
27th
that
was
had been
clear and
preceded
sunny,
it,
with the
the
fresh
one that
warmth
had
of
been
a full
constructed
summer
when the
day.
first people
The
settled
flowers
down to
were
make a
blooming
village here.
profusely, and the grass
Every
was
year
richly
after the
green.
lottery, Mr.
The
Summers
people of the
began talking
village
again
began
about
to
the new
gather in
box,
the
but
square
every
between the
year the
post
subject was
office and the
allowed to
bank.
fade off without anything being done. The black box grew shabbier each year, By now, it was no longer completely black but splintered badly
The
along one
Lottery
side to
by
show the
Shirley
original wood color
Jackson.
and in some places faded or stained.
The morning of June
Mr.
27th
Martin
was
and
clear
his
and
older
sunny,
son
with the
Baxter held the
fresh warmth
box
of a full
securely
summer
on the
day.
stool until
The
Mr.
flowers
Summers
were
had stirred the
blooming
papers
profusely, and
thoroughly
the
with his
grass was
hand.
richly
Because
green.
so much of the
The
ritual
people of
had
the
been
village
forgotten or
began to gather in the
discarded,
square between the
Mr.
post
Summers had
office
been
and the bank.
successful in having slips of papers substituted for the chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, had been all very well when the village was tiny, but now that the population was more than 300 and likely to keep on growing, it was necessary to use something that would fit more easily into the black box. That The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the slips of paper and put them into the box, and it was then taken to the safe of Mr. Summers' coal company and locked up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it to the square next morning. The rest of the year, the box was put away, sometimes one place, sometimes another. It had spent 1 year Mr. Graves' barn and another year underfoot in the post office, and sometimes it was set on a shelf in the Martin grocery and left there. There was a great deal of fusing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open. There were the lists to make up of heads of families, heads of households in each family, members of each household in each family. There was the proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmaster. As the official of the lottery at one time, some people remembered there had been a recital of some sort performed by the official of the lottery, a perfunctory, toneless chant that had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believe that the official of the lottery used to stand just so when he said or sang it. Others believed that he was supposed to walk among the people, but years and years ago, this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had been also a ritual salute, which the official of the lottery had to use in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box. But this also had changed with time. Until now, it was felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching Mr. Summers was very good at all this. In his clean white shirt and blue jeans, with one hand resting carelessly on the black box, he seemed very proper and important as he talked interminably to Mr. Graves and the Martins. Just as Mr. Summers finally left off talking and turned to the assembled villagers, Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over the shoulders, and slid into the place in the black of the crowd. Clean forget what day it was, she said. Thought my old man was out backstacking wood, Mrs. Hutchinson went on. And then I looked out the window and the kids was gone. And then I remembered it was the 27th and came a running. She dried her hands on her apron, and Mrs. Delacroix said, "You are in time, though. They are still talking away up there." Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to see through the crowd and found her husband and children standing near the front. She tapped Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a farewell and began to make her way through the crowd. The people separated good humoredly to let her through. Two or three people said, in voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd, "Here comes yours, Mr. Hutchinson." And Bill, she made it after all. Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting, said cheerfully, "Thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie," Mrs. Hutchinson said, grinning. "Wouldn't have me lived ambitious in the thing now, would you, Joe?" And soft laughter ran through the crowd as the people steered back into position after Mrs. Hutchinson's arrival. "Well, now," Mr. Summers said soberly, "guess we better get started, get this over with, so we can go back to work." Anybody ain't here? Dunbar, several people said. Dunbar! Mr. Summers consulted his list. Clyde Dunbar, he said. That's right, he's broke his leg. Hasn't he? Who's drawing for him? Me, I guess, a woman said, and Mr. Summers turned to look at her. Wife draws for her husband. Mr. Summers said, don't you have a ground boy to do it for you, Janie? Although Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village knew the answer perfectly well, it was the business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered. Horace is not but 16 yet, Mrs. Dunbar said gratefully. Guess I gotta fill in for the old man this year. Right, Mr. Summers said. He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked, Wasn't boy drawing this year? A tall boy in the crowd raised his hand. Here, he said, I'm drawing for mother and me. He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like, Good fellow, Jack, and glad to see your mother's got a man to do it. Well, Mr. Summers said, guess that's everyone. Old man Warner Merck it. Here, a voice said, and Mr. Summers nodded. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list. All ready? He called. Now I will read the names, heads of families first, and then men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has had a turn. Everything clear? The people had done it so many times that they only has listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around, and Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, Adams. A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. Hi, Steve, Mr. Summers said, and Mr. Adams said, Hi, Joe. They grinned at one another humorlessly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned and went hastily back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand. Allen, Mr. Summers said. Anderson, Bentham. Seems like there's no time at all between lotteries anymore, Mrs. Delacroix said to Mrs. Graves in the back row. Seems like we got through with the last one only last week. Time sure goes fast, Mrs. Graves said. Clark Delacroix. There was my old man, Mrs. Delacroix said. She held her breath while her husband went forward. Dunbar, Mr. Summers said, and Mrs. Dunbar went steadily to the box while one of the women said, Go on, Janie, and another said, There she goes. Where next? Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mrs. Graves came around from the side of the box, greeted Mr. Summers gravely, and selected a slip of paper from the box. By now, all through the crowd there were men holding the small folded papers in the large hands, turning them over and over nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stood together, Mrs. Dunbar holding the slip of paper. Herbert Hutchinson, get up there, Bill, Mrs. Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed. Jones, they do say, Mr. Adams said to old man Warner, who stood next to him, that over the North Village they are talking of giving up the lottery. Old man Warner snorted. Pack of crazy fools, he said. Listening to the young folks, nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they will be wanting to go back to living in caves. Nobody work anymore. Live that way for a while. Used to be a saying about lottery stewed corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chickweed and corns. There's always been a lottery, he added petulantly, but enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody. Some places had been already quite lotteries, Mrs. Adams said. Nothing but trouble in that, Old Man Warner said stoutly. Pack of young fools. Martin and Bobby Martin watched his father go forward. Overdyke, Percy. I wish they'd hurry, Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. I wish they'd hurry. They are almost through, her son said. You get ready to run, tell Dad, Mrs. Dunbar said. Mr. Summers called his own name and then stepped forward precisely and selected a slip from the box. Then he called Warner. Seventh, seventh year I've been in the lottery, Old Man Warner said as he went through the crowd. 77th time. Watson, the tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said, Don't be nervous, Jock, and Mr. Summers said, Take your time, son. Zanini! After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, All right, fellows. For a minute, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying, Who is it? Who's got it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons? Then the voice began to say, It is Hutchinson. It is Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it. Go tell your father, Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, You didn't give him time enough to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair. Be a good sport, Tessie, Mrs. Delacroix called, and Mrs. Graves said, All of us took the same chance. Shut up, Tessie, Bill Hutchinson said. Well, everyone, Mr. Summers said, that was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time. He consulted his next list. Bill, he said, you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons? There is Don and Eva, Mrs. Hutchinson yelled. Make them take their chance. Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie, Mr. Summers said gently. You know that as well as anyone. It wasn't fair, Tessie said. I guess not, Joe, Bill Hutchinson said regretfully. My daughter draws with her husband's family. That's only fair. And I've got no other family except the kids. Then, as far as drawing for families is concerned, it is you, Mr. Summers said in explanation. And as far as drawing for household is concerned, that's you too, right? Right, Bill Hutchinson said. How many kids, Bill? Mr. Summer asked formally. Three, Bill Hutchinson said. There is Bill Jr. and Nancy and little Dave and Tessie and me. All right then, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you got their tickets back? Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. Put them in the box then, Mr. Summers directed. Take Bill's and put it in. I think we ought to start over, Mrs. Hutchinson said, as quietly as she could. I tell you it wasn't fair. You didn't give him time enough to choose. Everybody saw that. Mr. Graves had selected the five slips and put them in the box, and he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground where the breeze caught them and lifted them off. Listen, everybody, Mrs. Hutchinson was saying to the people around her. Ready, Bill? Mr. Summers asked, and Bill Hutchinson, with one quick glance around at his wife and children, nodded. Remember, Mr. Summers said, take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave. Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy, who came willingly with him up to the box. Take a paper out of the box, Davy, Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed. Take just one paper, Mr. Summers said. Harry, you hold it for him. Mr. Graves took the child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight fist and held it with little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him. Nancy next, Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12 and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, switching her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box. Bill Jr., Mr. Summers said, and Billy, his face red and his feet overlarge, nearly knocked the box over as he got the paper out. Tessie, Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a minute, looking around defiantly, and then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched a paper out and held it behind her. Bill, Mr. Summers said, and Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with a slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, "I hope it's not Nancy," and the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd. "It is not the way it used to be," Old Man Warner said clearly. "People ain't the way they used to be." "All right," Mr. Summers said. "Open the papers." "Hurry, you open little Dave's." Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank. "It is Tessie," Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. "Show us her paper, Bill." Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it, the black spot Mr. Summer had made the night before with a heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summers said. "Let's finish quickly." Mr. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, "I can't run at all. You will have to go ahead, and I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers, with Mrs. Graves beside him. "It isn't fair. It isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her.